conversation. So perhaps to start us off, could you perhaps tell us what is Code Refresh and why does this matter for Richmond right now?
Sure. Great to see you all. I think one of the things I didn't realize in the prep is that you were interviewing me. I was like, you're the expert here. Like, there's got to be both of us conversing. For some reason, I thought somebody else would be interviewing both of us, but this is great.
I think I'm interviewing myself.
Okay, great. I have a bunch of questions I'd love to ask you too, Laura, so we might go there too. So what is a code refresh? So, you heard Richard talk about our city zoning code. That has been in place since the 1970s, by and large, right? Now, there have been some very recent changes to that zoning code, kind of citywide ordinances that have passed, primarily around ADUs and around parking restrictions. So we have had some very recent changes to the zoning code, but the actual block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood analysis of what kind of building is allowed and what kind of building is not allowed was really baked into this zoning code that's existed since, I think, 1976. I think for a long time, and I've shared this at various forums, Richmond was one of the first cities in the country that actually used its zoning code to very explicitly bar black families from living in certain neighborhoods. And it was written into the code. This is back in the early 1900s, and by whatever point they realized, we can't really do that, they started to change the language of that zoning code. And then they found other ways to residentially segregate communities. And one of those main ways was an insistence on certain widths of lot size or requirements for single family home development. And so, that has been consistent in our code for a really long time. And it has meant that anytime you want to do something outside of that, you got to go through a special use permitting process. You've got to, get input from neighbors, and you've got to go through planning commission and ultimately city council. And there are good things about that, right? I mean, I think there are important steps of that process that have allowed for crazy things not to be built in neighborhoods. But there are also a lot of challenges to that, right? You heard also Richard say in his introduction, we have experienced this incredible increase in housing costs. And the major driver for that is that we have tons of people coming to Richmond because Richmond is awesome and people want to live here, but we do not have enough housing to meet those needs. And so you've seen the average median price of home sales and the average rental prices just go up and up and up. You've seen an inordinate number of people who are now having to be cost burdened to pay more than 50% of their income to try to stay housed. And so the code refresh is really a look at what are the rules, the code that dictates how things can be built, where they can be built, what kind of housing can exist in different communities, and to try to open that up and to think about how do we actually address the root issues to the housing stock and housing supply in our city.
That's well said, and I don't know if anyone else here is a Richmond history nerd that knows what else is going on in Richmond in the 1970s when we passed our zoning code. Anyone want to hazard a guess? It looks like you might know over here.
Are you referring to when the Supreme Court decided that we weren't allowed to annex any more land because we were doing it in a really racist way?
Yes, that is around yes. That is when the city of Richmond took on a very purposeful step to try to annex parts of both Henrico County and Chesterfield County. Henrico fought it, but then leaders in Richmond and Chesterfield colluded together in backdoor conversations to annex a large chunk of Chesterfield that was mostly white residents in an effort to maintain white control of city council and white control of Richmond government. So it's hard not to acknowledge these two things happening at the same time. It was shortly after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, which was the last of the civil rights laws that passed, and only passed 6 days after the assassination of MLK. They let black people vote before they were willing to let black people live next to them. And I think that says a lot. And a lot of the zoning codes, including people might know the case you're referring to of Euclid, where the Supreme Court analogized having a multifamily apartment building in a single family neighborhood as the same thing as a pig in the parlor. That was the attitude and the animus of the people who designed zoning codes across Virginia, not just in Richmond, but also Charlottesville and so many other places. So it's in that context of the status quo that was embedded at the time that we've been stuck with, trying to fix it through these individual SUP process. And we're trying to change the status quo now. One of the themes that keeps coming up, and I think a lot of people have understandable concerns and anxiety around, is affordability. But before we get into details, perhaps we should step back a little bit. And what is affordability?
I mean, I mentioned the sort of concept of being cost burdened, right? And I think, generally across the country, the ideal goal is that people aren't spending more than 30% of their income towards housing. And increasingly, we're seeing people have to spend 50 and 60% of their income, if that, to be able to find a roof over their head. So I think cost burden is one way that we think about it. We also often talk about affordability in the context of AMI, area median income. And so when we talk about building new housing, we talk about different tiers. So kind of the 0 to 40% AMI window, 40 to 80% AMI window, 80 to 120 and beyond. And so that's often like in the development world, in the tax credit world, and the way that affordable housing is financed. We think about it a lot in terms of AMI. I do think one of the challenges to that is that our area median income is set on the median income of the entire region. And if you start to parse out Richmond City income versus the surrounding counties, area median income in the counties is a lot higher. And so even us trying to get to an 80% of the region's AMI, we're talking $80,000, $90,000, $100,000 for a family, and we know for Richmond residents that is exceedingly difficult to get to.
Yeah, and I think people's everyday understanding of affordability is they just want housing that fits within their budget. And that's going to look different depending on your income level and whether or not you're going to qualify for subsidies. In the housing space, when we talk about affordable housing, it has a very specific meaning. We're talking about subsidized housing that, in order to get into the housing, you have to have income below a certain level, and it varies depending on the source of funds to do that. We have public housing that serves our lowest income residents. We have housing choice vouchers, again, serving lowest income residents. It allows them to take that subsidy and go out into the private market to find housing. And then we have other things like low income housing tax credits and performance grant agreements. But in terms of affordability for everyday people, maybe at higher income, when you have not enough housing at the highest income people, usually you can afford to go look out and try to find housing that might normally be for someone who's middle income. And if you're middle income, you can't find something that you can afford, you will then go look for housing that's maybe typically for someone who's lower income. But our lowest income people have no other option other than to absorb those very large rent increases. And if they can't do that, then they get displaced and have to move out from our city. So affordability has some very specific terms, but for everyday people, they're just looking for something that can fit within their budgets, and we have to have solutions at every range to really address it on a whole scale.
Yeah, probably worth talking about another nuance around affordability is how that affordability is achieved, right? And so, the market will dictate some of this, and so there are kind of older apartments that have just gone into disrepair, and so that's what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. When there is enough housing for all of those other tiers, and to your point, Laura, that hasn't been the case here in Richmond, right? The fact that we have not been able to keep up with the housing stock to meet the demand of people who want to live here means that each of those tiers are going to folks at kind of the next income level up, which ultimately squeezes our lowest income families. I think the other important point is that the vast majority of real affordable housing doesn't happen without subsidy. It takes public dollars, whether those are local, state, or federal, and often it takes all of those a combination in developing a capital stack to actually create affordable housing for residents looking for it.
Yeah, and there's been some really great reporting from the Private Equity Stakeholder Project that has found that private equity investors have found that whether you call it naturally occurring affordable housing, I've tried to step away from that term because there's nothing natural about it. It is the product of disinvestment, are now buying up those properties. We've seen this across Richmond, especially during the pandemic. No longer your local property manager, now it's some out-of-state LLC that rents in those class called workforce housing, I'll use that term, have gone at 2 times higher than everything else across the board.
Yeah.
And some of the internal documents from these investment companies are taking advantage of housing scarcity. They know that there is a larger growing captured renter class. They're just not able to get into home ownership because the stock of starter homes, we just haven't been building them. And they know that it's an easy cash flow and that people have no other choice than to accept those increases in rent or addition of new fees. And they are specifically targeting markets that have high job growth and in-migration, which I say fairly characterizes the city of Richmond, and are taking advantage of the fact that people have few choices and there is scarcity. And so I guess that gets into the next question of, how can zoning reform actually influence housing supply and cost?
Yeah. So kind of back to this basic premise that the main reason we have seen housing costs rise so much over the last decade in Richmond is supply and demand, right? That we have had so many people who want to live here, not enough people, and not enough houses to absorb that, and so that has created a market where housing costs go up and up and up. And this is not just a Richmond issue, right? Like, this is happening around the country. It's why the federal government right now, there's a bipartisan bill making its way through Congress called the Road to Housing Act, and really a core element of the Road to Housing Act is how do we increase supply? How do we incentivize local communities to either reduce regulation or through other means actually get to more housing production? Same thing has been happening in the General Assembly this year as Governor Spanberger and her housing agenda has really focused around how do we create more resources to grow supply. And so I think that's a huge component of it. The code, like the zoning code, is a part of what restricts supply sometimes. And so the more that we can think about building out a zoning code where builders can build more by right and not have to go through these sort of burdensome administrative processes, the quicker they can get to building. And the quicker you can get to building, ultimately the less cost that creates for the builder and ultimately the consumer. And there's other parts of this, right? Like zoning code is one of the tools that we can use to increase supply. I think looking at our administrative processes as a city is another one, right? Like thinking about the permitting process and how complicated that's been historically. And so planning and development, the team that Kevin Vonk leads has done a lot of work over the last year and a half to just look internally and say, how do we reduce the red tape? How do we make our process work better? You have a navigator that can help navigate things through City Hall. One of the things we've realized is that, it's not just planning and development, right? There are multiple agencies, multiple processes that a permit will touch, including Department of Public Works and Department of Public Utilities and sometimes the fire department. And so we've got more work that we need to do internal to City Hall around like our process improvement and how do we use technology more effectively to track a permit as it's going through the city's process. So, we're zoning code is one part of it. I think really looking at our own processes is one part of it. And then funding tools are another part of it. And so our Housing and Community Development Department has done a lot of work. Like we just passed legislation, Ellen Robertson and I worked for probably the last 6 months to create a predictable funding stream for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And so now we take a certain percentage of new tax revenues every year, 2.5% of new tax revenue growth, and we put that right into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So that's about $10 to $15 million a year that'll go into the AHTF. And a lot of things that we heard from nonprofit developers and private developers alike is the need for predictable, consistent funding to help support these affordable, to support affordable housing. And so that's another tool and performance grants, and I could go on and on about the different financial tools that have been added over the years to help accelerate growth.
Yeah, I think one of the things that excites me about the prospect of code refreshes is for affordable housing providers, they have like the littlest wiggle room to deal with these unpredictable rezoning processes and SUPs. For private development, from point of purchasing the land to turnkey is approximately 3 years, and that's a fast timeline. And that's just for market rate housing. When you're talking about affordable housing, add additional 2 years on top of that. So if we want to actually deliver on subsidized housing that we need to make it easier for them to navigate this process. And they're having to deal with the delicate, balance of these capital stacks and funding streams. And it really restricts where they're able to build. They're not going to go build in, an opportunity-rich neighborhood because they're going to face backlash from community members or have to deal with a really difficult public process for rezoning, and they just can't take on that risk. And so for me, one of the bigger winners is really helping our affordable housing providers actually, navigate a process and have that predictability about where they can build and be able to build in more areas.
Yeah. Maybe I think one of the tensions that we've had to manage through the multiple rounds of drafts and community input is the fear that communities have that the aesthetic, the look of my neighborhood is going to change if we just go super loosey-goosey with the zoning code, and those are real concerns, right? I mean, I think one of the really charming things about Richmond is the aesthetic of our neighborhoods and the fact that neighborhoods have a look and a feel and a scale that makes you want to be there and makes you want to spend time there. And so I think, we've heard that really loudly and clearly, and I think that the planning and development team that has been sort of shepherding this process has really taken that feedback seriously, and each iteration that comes out has reflected a lot of what the community has said. So things like form-based development or using a pattern book to make sure that new development in the community matches what's there. From draft 1 to draft 2, there was a real shift in some of the heights that are dictated so that they would fit more and there would be more of a transitional feel for new development in a neighborhood, as opposed to being able to put a 4-story thing next to a bunch of 1-story houses. So there have been a lot of changes even from version 1 to version 2, and I expect even more changes from version 2 to version 3. But I think the community feedback process has really helped shape that.
Yeah. Turning back to, we talked about the origins of Richmond zoning code. How do you see code refresh intersecting with equity, and how does it potentially help address inequities or risk reinforcing them?
I'll share just a little bit about kind of my personal story. So I moved to Richmond in 2000 to go to medical school. My wife and I decided that we wanted to stay in Richmond in large part because of the story of this city, right? When we learned about Richmond's place in history, the capital of the Confederacy, the birthplace of the domestic slave trade, a place where policy and investment over and over and over decades has kind of entrenched racial disparities in health outcomes, social outcomes, educational outcomes. For me professionally, I realized I want to do medicine, but what I was really interested in are these more macro issues of equity and disparity. And so I decided to pursue a career in public health, but I also decided to plant roots here and be a part of what was happening in Richmond and wanting to be a part of this city's story moving forward, never thinking that I would be in this seat, but knowing that Richmond was a place where some amazing things were happening, like some real grappling with history was happening, and wanting to join that. And so not only did we make a decision to stay in Richmond, but we also made a decision to move into the East End of Richmond. And so this is in 2004 in North Churchill, where the neighborhood was almost entirely low-income African-American at the time. My wife took a job at Chimborazo Elementary, which is the elementary school that was serving that part of the neighborhood, and I was starting my residency across the bridge at VCU. And so, and that was a very intentional move for us, right? Like the desire to be in a community where we would have the opportunity to be connected relationally to people that we just wouldn't see otherwise, right? Like so much of our community experience is dictated by our history and our laws that create certain types of houses and certain types of communities, and that what also follows that is a certain demographic, income-wise, often racially, and so the desire to move into a community and to pursue, the driver for us was really an introduction to Martin Luther King's beloved community concept. This idea that people across racial lines, across socioeconomic lines, could live in community, could choose to be in a relationship, could pursue racial healing through significant intentionality. And that was what, for my wife and I and a group of friends, compelled us to move into the East End of Richmond. And so, kind of fast forward 10, 12, 15 years, and I think the growth of our city drastically changed the makeup of our neighborhood, and what had been this rich experience of the beloved community for over a decade, with deep relationships with folks who had grown up in poverty, with newcomers to Richmond, with folks from so many different backgrounds, had started to change because many of my low-income neighbors could no longer afford to live in Churchill, and were getting actively pushed out of the neighborhood. And so I think that experience, and I remember very vividly about 8 years ago, there was a front page article in USA Today, and it named Churchill as one of the top 10 hottest neighborhoods in the entire country. And for me, that was this signal that oh man, this neighborhood is gone, right? And it was hard because on one hand, it was so many good things were happening in the neighborhood, right? Like Sub Rosa and Union Market and all of these great businesses were coming and making it like a place that you wanted to be and spend time and eat and hang out. But that growth without protections for the long-term residents, without thoughtfulness on how we do anti-displacement well, just kind of letting the market do its thing, clearly led to what we see now, which is a pretty homogenous neighborhood, and worse, so many of the neighbors that have lived there for decades are now struggling to find a place. Often moving out to the counties or moving down to Petersburg, or having to transition into public housing. And so I think. This is a long-winded answer to how does the zoning code impact equity, and I think a big part of me even running for mayor was the experience of living in this neighborhood and knowing that if we don't address issues of the code, if we don't get more proactive about anti-displacement programming, this is going to happen in every neighborhood, and frankly is happening in many neighborhoods in our city right now.
Yeah, and if you look at where development has happened in the city, it's in middle and low-income neighborhoods that perhaps don't have the resources, the time to go push against any SUP process, but we're not seeing the same development spread throughout the city. And we remain a very segregated city. If you want to dig into this topic a bit more, there's a really great report that Home partnered with professors at VCU and University of Richmond, also worked with Partnership for Housing Affordability to look at both housing and school outcome segregation. And those two are so closely linked, and it's pretty devastating and stark. And I, you may not be able to be as pointed as me on this, but I really see, maintaining the status quo as opportunity hoarding. If you're limiting development or excluding development from some areas, you're also hoarding the opportunities that those communities hold. And I think that, we need a radical diversification of our housing, of the types and availability, to help combat against that. Not to say that things are going to change overnight, but we know the status quo isn't working. One of the reports that Home also did was looking at, what displacement has already happened in the city, and where we've seen our loss of Black population in the city. And it's because people are getting priced out. We work with, first-time home buyers, first-generation home buyers, doing counseling and also providing down payment assistance. And people who want to continue living in the community that they grow up in, they just can't compete against people who are able to drop cash to buy a house. And so that's part of why we've seen these home values go up, and this is also affecting people who are trying to stay in their homes as their property values are going up. So not to say that code refresh is going to fix all of that, but it has to be part of the solution, because continue to do the same is just going to mean more people displaced.
Yeah. And I would add, none of it will fix any of this overnight, right? You think about the zoning code that we're operating under, and it took decades to sort of have this play out. And I think changing the zoning code is not going to fix this in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years, right? Like, it will take a couple of decades to see some kind of correction on that. And then maybe just another pointed hook to the equity question. You know, what you were said, the study you were talking about made me think about like the national body of evidence around social and educational outcomes for low-income families and how they are drastically improved when people move into mixed income communities. And so Raj Chetty, who's a economist up at Harvard, has done kind of longitudinal studies over 30 years around the Hope 6 public housing funding. And so looking at Hope 6 public housing redevelopments across the country and tracking families and their outcomes over now 30 years. And what just each study after study shows is that there's some movement, not great movement for the families, for the adults that make that move themselves, but there are significant improvements in educational outcomes and income attainment for the next generation. And so part of how we ought to think about this is not like, what are we gonna solve now, or how quickly can we fix this? Although, you know, we have other tools to try to do that, but how do we build the city we want to be 30 years from now? And I think really figuring out how to use zoning as one tool to create more mixed income community is part of that.
We touched on displacement a little bit. That has been, you know, a major concern for a lot of people. What protection should be in place alongside co-refresh? What are tools like anti-displacement overlays or other strategies on the table?
Yeah. Well, I'll talk kind of programmatically about what the city has done, and I admittedly, like, we have a bunch of programs in place that haven't always been administered very well. You know, I think one that has made the news a lot in the last year is our GAP grant program, right? Like ARPA money that was, or not ARPA money, but money that was set aside to try to provide low-income families, you know, one-time rent payments to be able to keep them housed, and just at the end of the day, the administration of like receiving those applications, doing the financial screening, just wasn't executed very well, and so not enough people were helped by that. So a big part of our strategy is to try to use partners and improve our own processes so that we're actually executing these programs well. Some of those programs, the older adult tax deferral process or tax rebate, the OAPD program. We have, always blanking on these. Where's my team? Eviction diversion, there you go. We have funding that's set aside for eviction diversion programming, for right to counsel programming, and then money in the Family Crisis Fund that could actually go towards direct either utility payments or housing payments. And so those are some of the buckets of money that the city has used over the last couple of years to try to keep people housed where they are. And then, yeah, I think there are sort of newer policy things like the overlay that I don't know enough about. I'd love for you to speak on it as well. But I mean, I think there are opportunities to figure out like how do we create the protections for long-term residents.
Right, and I think part of it is identifying, you know, the neighborhoods that have the highest risk of displacement, where we currently see displacement, and looking at like what tools and leverage do we need to ensure that people can stay in place and really have power of choice and whether they want to stay or whether they want to go. And you know, a big piece of that is we have some really great new tools coming from the state. The state is authorized. Unfortunately, being a Dillon rule state, you know, the city is somewhat limited in what we can do. We need the authorization from our General Assembly, but two of those are incentive zoning, some people call it inclusionary, as well as the right of first refusal to help us try to preserve our affordable housing stock. How are you seeing these come into play?
Yeah, well, one other one is giving economic development authorities like bond authority to be able to issue new bonds for affordable housing. So that's one we're really excited about. I mean, I think if hopefully that goes through, our EDA can make the decision then to issue bonds, create a revolving loan fund, and so each new development that's really struggling to find how do you fill the gaps in that capital stack, that creates a huge new tool for us. And then I think inclusionary zoning has been hotly debated. There have been 6 local localities around the state that have been able to do that historically. And really, it gives us the ability to kind of incentivize a certain number of, or a certain percentage of affordable units with each new project that comes online. And so a lot more for us to learn as it makes its way through. I mean, it has been approved, and I think,
yes,
yeah, it's been signed, right? Yeah, right. So I think it does create some new possibilities, and we've got to figure out, okay, like, how do we best use this tool in the city of Richmond?
Yeah, and for me, one of the biggest tools to have for helping prevent displacement is protecting the stock of affordable housing that we have now. A lot of times those Yeah, and for me, one of the biggest tools to have for helping prevent displacement is protecting the stock of affordable housing that we have now. A lot of times those financing terms, the deal that makes it affordable expires after a set period of time. And, one of our experts here could probably tell us the number of units that are about to roll off their affordability period. But we'll have this great new tool that the city can either have the option to purchase or transfer that right to affordable housing developer to help ensure that we preserve that affordability for the long run. And that one of the other exciting tools in the incentive zoning bill is not just having the density bonuses, but others around conditions. One of the big things that drives people from their homes are deteriorating conditions that are really expensive to fix, and oftentimes renters, they're not able to qualify for those different repair programs that homeowners might, and are stuck with a slumlord who may not be willing to fix it. And that could be part of what drives people out. So to me, part of preventing displacement is also protecting our stock of housing that we have now, ensure that people can live in habitable conditions, are not driven out by mold that is making them unhealthy, or rodents that's unsafe. And so that, I think, has to be a part of the conversation too.
That's great. I'm curious, Laura, you've been paying super close attention to the code refresh process, the drafts, the input. Are there things that felt really good about the transition from draft 1 to draft 2, and things that you were concerned about from draft 1 to draft 2?
I mean, from draft 1 to draft 2, we saw a drastic reduction in the amount of density of housing that we were going to have across the city, which I found to be disappointing, and also a rollback on duplexes by right across the city. Yeah. Something that was set as a goal, and our Richmond 300 plan. It's one of those things you're not going to see a change overnight, but it does open up housing opportunities in areas that have, previously closed the gates. And use an example for like our clients who have a housing choice voucher. It's a subsidy they're supposed to take with them to the private market. The whole point is based off of, building off of some of the studies that Raj Chetty did, show the effectiveness. But a lot of our clients are actually not able to place that in, higher income neighborhoods or near chosen schools because so many communities have shut their gate, or there's just not available rental opportunities in certain parts of the city. But where we have seen new housing added, like in Scott's Addition, we've been able to place voucher holders in Scott's Addition in an area of the city that they would have previously been excluded from. And so for that reason, I think duplexes and ADUs could open up more housing opportunities for our clients across the city in areas that they have up until this point been excluded from.
Oh, well.
Before we go to some audience questions, I guess, ending on the note of if code refresh doesn't move forward, what do you see happening to affordability and displacement in the city? Who benefits from the current zoning system and who is left out?
Yeah. Well, what do I see happening is like what has been happening, right? Which is that low income, predominantly people of color, are getting squeezed out of their communities. Outside folks are coming in and able to purchase a lot more or compete a lot better because they're coming from markets like DC and New York. And it makes our communities more homogenous, less mixed, and really like hurts the connectivity that I think so many of us want in our communities. So I do think there are like really significant relational and community oriented priorities that we're missing out if we don't find ways to move the code refresh forward. And You know, I ultimately this is a political process where the city council is going to have to vote, and you know, like our job is going to be to make the strongest argument of how we've listened to as many different segments of the community as possible, how we've digested that information, and done our best work to put the best plan forward for the next 30 years. And convince as many council members as possible to get there. So
And I think the message there is the status quo isn't working,
Yeah.
and you know, a part of Code Refresh is trying to fight against the inertia of status quo. I think my vision for Code Refresh is I want housing so abundant that if a renter is dealing with a slumlord who won't fix the problems, that they can walk out, go down the street into a new house, not be forced to move out of the city. And that is my hope and wish for Code Refresh.
yeah, love it. It's great.
All right, Annika, you had some questions for us.
I do indeed. So the first question we have from the audience is, how can the city help level the playing field between tenants and large corporate landlords and slumlords?
Well, I think part of what I just said at the end is that, you know, I mentioned that report showing that private equity landlords increasingly targeting Richmond. I think both because we have very weak landlord-tenant protections in our state code that makes it very fast, cheap, and easy to evict people, and you know, it's these private equity landlords that are responsible for the mass majority of our eviction filings that are using evictions as a rent collection method, and yet, you know, they're jacking up the rent, you know, 30% rent increases, adding on new fees because they can get away with it, because tenants don't, without choice in your housing, you don't have power to challenge the landlord, and they know that tenants have nowhere else to go but to deal and put up with these conditions. And if we're going to push back against that power, we need to stop letting them take advantage of the scarcity that is artificial that we built with the rules and regulations that we have. And so part of it is making sure that we have more affordable housing options so that folks who are low income aren't stuck absorbing these large rent increases, and actually get into some deeply affordable units that will help stabilize them and stabilize their rent until they're able to increase their income. We need more, you know, starter homes so that people who are currently in a captured renter class can actually get into home ownership and start building wealth and equity. And you know, there's a lot we have to do outside of Code Refresh, but you know, with more choice comes more power for tenants. It's hard to fight back against a corporate landlord when they know that they got you over a barrel, and you have no other choice but to stay in your unhabitable housing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe two things I'd add to that. One is the expansion and optimization of the voucher landscape. I think you know, the federal government has moved for years away from funding bricks and mortar public housing to shifting to vouchers. And we have not been at the leading edge of that transition. And so really accelerating public housing development, making sure that the housing choice voucher and project-based voucher landscape, that we're maximizing its utilization across the city, that we're developing new mixed income communities that have a significant project-based voucher component, just locks in deep affordability for folks. And then the second, and you know, this is a model, actually Enterprise, which is one of the large affordable housing developers across the country, brought this model to us. The project they worked on up in Montgomery County, Maryland, where the county government actually developed a mixed income, like probably like 60% market rate, and then a couple of different tiers of affordability, but the government maintained ownership of that, right? And so kind of the concept of municipally owned mixed income housing is interesting, and so we're kind of poking at that and seeing, like, does that make sense as another tool to add to the toolbox?
And another great tool that passed the General Assembly is also the right of first refusal for our folks living in manufactured housing, to help better ease the path for them to take community control of their park, to help, you know, stabilize rents and conditions in the park. So that's another exciting tool that I'm excited coming online.
Next question is, what do you see as the role of low density zoning in Richmond? In some context, it says 20% 50-foot lots and 15% 90-foot lots means 1/3 1/3 of Richmond land is low density. They have extremely high costs for infrastructure, utilities, environmental, parentheses, tree cover. Seems like more dense zones have to subsidize the low density zones.
You want to take a stab?
I don't know. You lost me on that one. What was it?
Yeah, it was like a. I felt that way. I felt like the question answered itself. Yeah, I mean, I think again, I'll speak to the tension of like trying to maintain an aesthetic of a community while addressing like these real issues of affordability and an opportunity for integration. And so I mean, I don't know. We just had a survey done that Housing Opportunities Made Equal actually led, right? And 90% of the respondents said affordable housing was like the #1 issue in our community, and I think 51% answered the question that like we need more dense communities, right? We need more building in communities, and so I just think that when it's your neighborhood and you're worried about how it's going to change, like how drastically it's going to change, that's a pretty scary thing, and so we've got to like make it more real, and whether that's through visualizations or through like clear communication of how zoning would impact a community. But I think the overwhelming majority of people want us to address affordability, and through more density, more housing types, more housing options are the path to get there.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember we're a majority renter city.
Yeah.
And I think that's like a voice that perhaps hasn't been captured in a lot of the conversations around code refresh and what this means for people's ability to stay. And also like a lot of these artificial restrictions that were put in place that created scarcity, that created, like I use the term opportunity hoarding, and we're not going to see change overnight. But I think I encourage folks to approach code refresh with a sense of curiosity. Change is scary. Especially, you see all these apartments going up and people are like, oh, well, they're already building all this housing. But if you look at how dense we used to be compared to now, and the gap and the need that we have, we're not there yet. And it's only been concentrated in a few parts of the city. And some of these changes, I think, to help evenly distributed, and also, going back to the equity question of, where you build matters, and if we're only continuing to build in, low-income neighborhoods, we're going to continue to see displacement. And I think it's incumbent on us all to, think about the bigger picture and the long-term health of our city.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the reasons. My hope is that the zoning code ends up in a place where, we have transit-oriented zoning in every district across the city, and that creates opportunities for more density and more mix in every district, because it really is about its equity of opportunity, and the code plays a big role in that.
All right, this is a long one. Displacement is an ongoing concern, especially among lower income tenants. While we need new development to increase supply, new development can also push rental prices up in the surrounding area, displacing renters and longtime residents. How can the city protect affordability for current renters while also encouraging code refresh? Both are necessary.
Yeah, I do think there's kind of like a tipping point. I mean, just as we've watched other cities that have really focused on production, housing's not going to get cheaper. I mean, I think we got to be really honest about that. I don't think we're going to see significant decreases in rental rates without subsidy, right? So, but what we can see, and what I think many communities have been able to see, is that if they can keep up with demand by production, you can actually taper off the rapid increase that we've been experiencing. And so that's a part of the answer, is that this isn't going to solve the increase we've already seen. I think our best hope is to see a plateauing. Now, there may be an impact with new production where cities like Phoenix, actually, where the intercity visit is going to be, and so there'll be a group of Richmonders that are heading there in a couple of weeks. Phoenix, Austin are both examples of where they produce so much new workforce housing that older apartments have actually gotten cheaper. And so I think there are a couple of different components, and then I've already talked about sort of all the anti-displacement programming and kind of funding that we've got to do to try to keep people in their homes. One other thing that I think is continued to, or worth continuing to look at is the LOOP program from Philadelphia, the long-term owner occupancy program. It's something that passed the General Assembly maybe 2 years ago, it passed as a study, right? GA decided, hey, well, this is something we should study in the state of Virginia. The study results came back too late for this last General Assembly to actually act on, and there were some concerns about the quality of the study. So that's going to go through, I think, another round. But a program like that actually creates tax deferral or tax abatement for long-term residents of a community that meet a certain income threshold. Tools like that, I think, are really important for anti-displacement.
Yeah, and that's one that, again, because Virginia has to be a weird state, when it comes to taxing policy, it requires a constitutional amendment in order for the city of Richmond to have the authority to be able to, right now you have the authority to help with property tax for seniors and for folks who have a permanent disability, but to broaden that to more of our longtime residents, it's going to require a constitutional amendment. But again, zoning I see as a way to help make it easier to build affordable housing, using the new tools online. Part of what increases rents in those areas has to do with, the investors coming in know that they can charge high rents, which means you have high income people, the only ones who can afford there, and that is what increases it further. But if we're able to build more mixed income communities and more affordable housing, that can help stabilize rents in those communities and help, deal with those downward pressures that we're currently seeing due to scarcity and help stabilize people in their housing.
I know you guys talked about inclusionary zoning a little bit, but I don't quite address this question, which is, will the city use new authority from the General Assembly to make inclusionary zoning part of the code refresh?
Yeah, when City Council and the administration were determining what our legislative priorities would be for this year, like inclusionary zoning was at the top of that list. So I think the next step is to really look at and understand what got passed at the state level, what authority, and you probably do have some better answers to this. So I think we've got to know what is our next step and how can the tool actually be used at the local level. But I'd love Laura's.
Yeah, so the law that passed and the governor signed, it has a delayed enactment date, so it won't actually go into effect until July 1 of next year. So in the meantime, they're also supposed to put together a stakeholder group to kind of frame out what this looks like, because it expands not just existing tools that some localities have around these density bonuses, but pretty, more broad authority of what that could look like. A model that some of us advocates have been looking at is in Charlottesville that has, authority under the existing code, where they identified, some historically black neighborhoods that have already experienced some displacement, and basically put in some protective zoning to say, you can't demolish a house and put up, a 5-story apartment building unless you include affordable units. So it is able to do two things at once: help, protect this neighborhood that has experienced displacement, ensure that if there is development, that there is affordability built in. So that's a possibility for the city to look at as this new tool comes online.
Yeah, I think one additional comment I would make about it is that I have a lot to learn about how inclusionary zone, how this version will work and how it's worked in different places. I think builders, developers will say policies like that really shut down the flow of capital into a community, and so we need to look at that, but we also need to make sure that we're balancing how do you keep development happening, how do you keep production happening, but also make sure that there are enough affordable options for everyone. So I think it can be a really useful tool, and we've got a lot to learn.
Yeah, and unfortunately we're still somewhat limited in how it's compared to how it's used in other states, because you still cannot require any development to include affordable units. It's just an incentive tool. But fortunately, there's new options on the table to explore, and I'm excited for those forthcoming conversations.
Yeah.
How much time do we have left for questions?
One more.
Okay. What is
I don't know the answer to that one.
No.
3% is the current rental vacancy rate,
Well,
and that's down
yes.
from 5% last year.
Wow.
Okay.
Why is the rental vacancy rate important? What does it mean in general?
I mean, it means that people have fewer choices in where they move to, and it means that landlords know there's restricted supply and they can increase rents because there's not available open units elsewhere. And so, having a higher vacancy rate means that there's more competition between landlords to either like lower rents or at least not increase them as much, because then you have landlords competing for tenants rather than tenants competing for housing.
We can do one more house.
Let's see. With the rapid increase in density, there are some intended and anticipated impacts, and some less so. A lot of people buy houses in the Mary Mumford School District so that their kids can go there. Which neighborhoods are zoned out as schools, as school is at capacity, and where do kids go?
Yeah, I think this is one of like the big concerns that's come up for folks who are like afraid of the density, right? And I think schools are one big part of that. Parking comes up, traffic comes up, utilities come up. Obviously, we lived through the whole water crisis, and they're like, do we really trust our water infrastructure to handle more density? And so, I mean, these are all considerations, and so we've got teams that are like simultaneously working through like, how do we best communicate to residents, like, what does the data say? Like, what are we doing to actually strengthen our water utility system and our sewage system? And what is the capacity of that? I mean, as a comparison on schools, like Richmond used to have 50,000 students. And granted, schools were way overcrowded at that point, but we're now at 24,000. And if you look at the capacity of many of our schools, particularly north of the river, there's a lot of opportunity for absorbing more of a student population there. So I do think on the south side, which is where we're seeing a lot of new development, we do have to be thoughtful about this. We do need to think about like how are we investing new money, and one of the things that's going to make that possible is another thing that's making its way through the General Assembly, which is a 1% option for a local sales tax for school construction. And so something that will likely be coming forward as a referendum for our community is a decision on whether we add a sales tax to fuel new school construction.
And I think too that I think it's worth stating that most families, they don't have the ability to send their kid to a chosen school because of our zoning laws, because of the type of housing that is allowed in certain neighborhoods. So I'm sure a lot of people live to send their kid to Mary Mumford, but cannot afford a home there because of the restrictive zoning that exists there.
Yeah.
And so opening up educational opportunity to be able to send kids to your chosen school, and also to bring resources to schools that have been under-resourced. We have to do it through our zoning. We have to do it at the state level through how we're funding our schools, because it's very unequal right now.
Yeah.
And that's just an inequity that if we don't do code refresh, we're going to continue to bake that in, and we're not going to be able to fix it unless we change this as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll just close with a thank you, because the fact that there's so many people in this room who care so much about these issues and are willing to learn more, I'm just really grateful. Every one of these I go to, I'm like, man, Richmond shows up, and sometimes it's to fight something and sometimes it's to support something, but like the fact that people care is like part of what makes it a joy to serve the city. And so thank you for being here. Know that the city is taking feedback incredibly seriously. We are trying to get as many voices from as many different places and make sure that's embedded into the next round. And maybe I'll just finish with a thought that I said earlier, which is that we are planning not for tomorrow, not for a year from now, but really like what is the Richmond of 30 and 50 years need to look like, and how do we best set ourselves up for that future vision of the city. So thank you
for
guys.
that.
Yeah.